Everything around you is screaming for your attention. And most people answer every time. They speak to prove they exist. They move to show they matter. They pack every quiet moment with sound, as though silence were a kind of failure. But the louder they become, the further they drift from anything real. Genuine power was never forged in constant output. It was shaped through restraint. Long before the world turned into this unrelenting feed of noise and demand, the Stoics had already mapped the territory. They recognized that anyone who surrenders authority over their own mind, their own words, and their own attention will inevitably find those things governed by something or someone else. Somewhere along the way, the world confused motion with momentum, volume with wisdom, and perpetual busyness with a life well lived. But if you look carefully at the people who are truly unshakable, the ones who remain grounded when everything around them is shaking, you'll notice something. They don't announce themselves. They don't scramble to explain. They are not battered around by every passing impulse. There is an interior order in them, a settled quality that holds steady even when the world does not. The mind moves faster than most people are willing to admit. One instant everything feels controlled, and then a single offhand remark, a shift in someone's expression, or a message on a screen sends your thoughts into a spiral. You replay what was said. You imagine what might follow. You construct entire arguments and outcomes inside your head, scenarios that feel urgent and vivid, even though they have not occurred and may never occur. It feels like preparation. It feels like awareness. But slow it down and look honestly. Most of that internal churning is not actually solving anything. It is not protecting you. It is simply consuming the one resource you can never recover: your attention. There is a pattern people develop without ever deciding to. They begin treating every thought as if it carries weight, as if every fragment of mental activity demands full examination and a considered verdict. But the vast majority of thoughts are not insights. They are echoes, recycled anxieties, conditioned reflexes, background noise dressed up as meaning, and yet people hold them, turn them over, feed them energy they were never meant to receive. That is not where exhaustion begins from overwork. It begins from overengagement with things that were never worth engaging with in the first place. Here is where a quiet shift becomes possible. You begin to notice, almost experimentally, that a thought appearing in your mind does not make it true. It does not make it useful. It does not automatically earn your time. It is simply an event, like weather passing overhead. And what you choose to do with it, that is where your actual authority begins. The Stoics were not in the business of eliminating thought. They practiced the art of filtering it. They understood that when every idea feels equally pressing, the mind becomes a place of chronic tension. You are always mid-reaction, always anticipating, always managing something that may not even be real. And eventually, that becomes the only mode you know. But patterns can be interrupted. Patterns can be retrained. It begins with something that sounds simple but requires everything you have. Letting a thought arise without immediately engaging it. At first that feels wrong, even slightly dangerous, because you have spent years reacting, following every thread, completing every loop. But when you pause, even briefly, something opens up. The urgency softens. The noise recedes. What remains is something far more valuable than constant mental activity: clarity. And clarity does not arrive through accumulation. It arrives through subtraction, through recognizing that most of what moves through your mind does not need to be resolved, analyzed, or even understood. It only needs to be observed and allowed to pass. Over time, you begin to map the patterns, the same fears revisiting, the same assumptions circling back, and the same imagined outcomes playing on repeat. Rather than being pulled under each time, you start to watch them from a slight distance, not as commands you must obey, but as habits you can now see. And once you see a habit clearly, it begins to lose its pull on you. This is where a quieter kind of control returns. Not control over what happens around you. That was always a partial illusion anyway. Control over where your attention actually lands. And that, it turns out, changes nearly everything. Because attention is finite. Every thought you pour yourself into costs you something real: time, energy, the focus that could have gone somewhere that genuinely matters. That is why the shift is worth making. Not for the sake of thinking less, but for the sake of thinking with intention. Choosing where your mind goes, rather than letting it be dragged wherever the loudest signal points. When that intentionality takes hold, something stabilizes. Problems that previously felt crushing begin to look navigable. Automatic responses, the reflexive defensiveness, the reflexive agreement, the reflexive panic, begin to feel optional rather than inevitable. You stop being a pinball bouncing between stimuli. You start moving with something that resembles direction. You also begin to notice something almost counterintuitive. The less you react, the more you actually perceive. The more space you create between event and response, the richer your understanding of what is actually happening. You are no longer trapped inside every moment. You are present to it, steady, aware, slightly removed from the chaos. That awareness confers a practical advantage that most people never develop. While others are already halfway through their reaction, you are still choosing yours. While others are overwhelmed, you are clear. That clarity does not come from doing more. It comes from removing everything that was never necessary and doing what remains with precision. Quiet, powerful, invisible from a distance, but unmistakable up close. If what you've just heard has landed somewhere meaningful, let it stay there. Don't let it dissolve in the noise of the next thing. Let it shape how you move, how you think, how you decide to spend the next hour. And if you feel ready to keep building that clarity, consider subscribing to Stoic Horizon, not as a reflex, but as a deliberate choice. As the habit of mental restraint deepens, something else begins to dissolve. The compulsion to anticipate every scenario, to pre-solve every possible problem, to remain in a state of perpetual readiness for situations that never materialize. You begin to trust your own capacity to respond when something actually arrives, rather than exhausting yourself rehearsing for things that exist only in projection. That trust is not passivity. It is efficiency, the highest kind. It is knowing the difference between preparation and performance anxiety dressed up as preparation. And in the space left behind, a calm appears that is not manufactured and not forced. It simply exists. The mind has not gone empty. It has gone selective, more deliberate, more honest about what deserves its energy. And because of that, every action becomes more precise. Not because you are trying harder, but because you are wasting less. When the mind is fragmented, the mouth follows. Words begin to flow not because there is something genuinely worth saying, but because silence feels like a vacuum that needs to be filled. People talk to establish presence, to defend position, to stay ahead of a judgment that may not even be coming. Conversations drift from understanding into performance, and over time, the sheer volume of output dilutes anything that might have had real meaning. There is a distinction that matters here. The difference between speaking from intention and speaking from pressure. Most people cannot locate that distinction because the habit formed long before they were paying attention. A thought arrives, and almost without pause, it converts into words. No gap, no filter, no honest evaluation of whether it needs to be said at all. But when you begin to slow that conversion process, something interesting happens. You catch the impulse before it exits. You feel it rise, you acknowledge its presence, and then, instead of releasing it automatically, you hold it for 1 second longer. And in that 1 second, you often discover that what you were about to say was unnecessary. Not harmful, just unnecessary. And that discovery is its own form of freedom. Initially, that restraint feels like suppression. There is an internal pressure, a fear that withholding words will make you seem absent or disengaged. But that discomfort passes quickly, far more quickly than you expect. And what replaces it is something that cannot be forced into existence any other way. The awareness that develops only when you are no longer occupied with your own next sentence. As that awareness deepens, The role you play in conversations quietly shifts. You are no longer pushing to participate in every thread. You are allowing the exchange to develop and choosing when your contribution actually adds something. Paradoxically, this makes your presence more substantial, not less. When you do speak, the words arrive from a place of considered clarity rather than reactive urgency. They carry more precision, more weight, more room to be genuinely heard. When you speak with less frequency, each thing you say gets more space around it. People lean toward it. They register it differently, not because you have become louder, but because you have become more deliberate. This is not about withdrawing from the world or cultivating an air of mystery. It is simply about understanding that selectivity is a form of respect for the conversation and respect for your own signal. You begin to observe something else. People who speak without filtering regularly give away more than they intend. They explain when no explanation was requested. They justify decisions that no one challenged. They surface doubts and plans and insecurities in the process of trying to connect. And in doing so, they hand away the clarity they could have kept. Once you notice this pattern, you cannot stop noticing it. Silence is not the absence of something. It is the presence of everything that matters. Over time, the reflex to fill space weakens on its own. The need for constant acknowledgement fades. What rises in its place is a quieter form of confidence, one that does not require continuous expression to sustain itself. You no longer need your words to confirm your value. Your actions, your presence, your consistency do that instead. Measured speech has always been associated with discernment, not because silence is inherently wise, but because it reflects something rare. The capacity to choose. The Stoics held this view deliberately. They treated language as a resource, not a reflex, something to be used carefully because its power diminishes with overuse. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth, Epictetus observed, suggesting the ratio itself encodes an instruction about how much to receive versus how much to transmit. As you practice this, as you develop an increasingly clear view of how heavily others rely on constant speech as a substitute for security. You see the interruptions, the overextensions, the desperate attempts to steer every conversation toward familiar ground. And rather than being absorbed into that pattern, you stay outside it, watching, listening, understanding more than anyone in the room who is busy talking. And when you do contribute, it lands differently. There is a directness to it. No hedging, no filler, no performance. Just the point. Clear, grounded, finished. That quality is impossible to manufacture through effort. It can only emerge through the discipline of restraint practiced consistently over time. This is where both threads begin to converge. Thinking less deliberately is not a reduction in intelligence. It is an upgrade in efficiency. And speaking less deliberately is not disengagement. It is precision. And applied together, consistently, they begin to produce something that neither could produce alone. Genuine clarity in how you move through the world. Once the noise begins to settle, not all at once, not dramatically, but in gradual layers. The energy that was scattered begins to gather. It has nowhere else to go. It pools. It becomes available. And that available energy has a name, attention, real, sustained, unclouded attention. Most people never experience this fully because their focus is constantly being redistributed. A bit here, a bit there, a momentary investment in something before the signal changes and the investment moves elsewhere. It produces the sensation of movement, the impression of productivity. But divided effort rarely achieves anything at the depth required for it to matter. It is not a lack of capability that holds most people in place. It is the absence of sustained, concentrated attention. That realization is uncomfortable because it dismantles the convenient story that busyness equals progress. The truth is more unsettling. Doing many things at moderate depth is not the same as doing one thing at full depth, and the results over time make the difference unmistakably visible. When that pattern is interrupted, even for a short window, the shift is immediate. You give something your complete focus, not because it is easy or natural, but because you have decided it is worth it. And in that decision, your relationship with the work changes. You are not managing your attention across competing demands. You are directing all of it toward one thing, and in that state, something develops that scattered effort simply cannot produce: depth. Depth takes time. It requires a willingness to resist the temptation to switch, to chase something new, to follow the path of least resistance whenever the current path becomes demanding. Every time you override that temptation, you reinforce a different kind of internal architecture, one built from consistency rather than impulse. Staying with one thing, especially once it becomes difficult, is where most people exit the process. The moment discomfort appears, attention searches for relief, a different task, a distraction, a reason to stop. But every exit reinforces the habit of exiting. And that habit, accumulated over years, is precisely what prevents the deep work from happening. Or choosing to remain, not because it feels good, but because you decided to remain, begins to build a different habit. One that does not depend on momentum or motivation to sustain it. One that functions even when conditions are imperfect. Every time you stay when your mind asks to leave, you are building something the distracted world cannot buy. As that consistency compounds, your relationship with output begins to change. Things that felt impossible at shallow engagement levels become achievable at full depth. Not because you have acquired new skills, but because you have concentrated existing capacity. The task has not changed. Your presence within it has. There is a clarity that accompanies this kind of focus, a directional confidence that replaces the ambient uncertainty that comes from constant task switching. You know what you are working toward. You are actually moving toward it. Not in occasional bursts followed by long periods of drift, but in steady, deliberate increments that accumulate into something real. This is where the nature of the shift becomes clearest. Focus stops feeling like a discipline you must impose on yourself and begins to function like a natural orientation, a default lens through which decisions pass. Instead of asking what feels most appealing right now, you ask what aligns with the direction you have chosen. That question alone eliminates an enormous amount of noise. You become more selective, not out of limitation, but out of understanding. You begin to see clearly that every choice to engage with one thing is a simultaneous choice to disengage from everything else competing for that same slot of attention. Once that trade-off is visible, your choices change accordingly. You stop treating your focus as infinitely renewable. You start treating it as the finite, precious resource it actually is. That selectivity might initially feel like narrowing, but it is the opposite. When attention is concentrated, it compounds, it builds, it refines, and that is what creates progress that lasts. Not the appearance of activity, but the accumulation of real depth over real time. The Stoics framed this with a directness that still cuts through. If a person gave away your body to some passerby, you'd be outraged. Yet you hand over your mind to anyone who comes along. That is not a gentle observation. It is a confrontation, because it describes something most people do every single day without ever deciding to. Attention scattered in all directions, given freely to things that return nothing and claim everything. When you begin to protect that attention, when you begin to direct it with intention, the results are not immediate and they are not loud. But they are real. And they compound in ways that eventually become undeniable. You start to see movement where there was previously stagnation. You start to feel grounded where there was previously drift. And, most importantly, you begin to operate with a sense of purpose. Not a dramatic or declared purpose, but a quiet orientation that governs how you use your time. That is the distinction. Not talent, not circumstance, not access to the right opportunities. Simply, sustained attention directed towards something that matters. Once that becomes your natural mode of operation, the pull toward constant distraction weakens, because you are no longer searching for something to pour yourself into. You have already found it. You are already building. There is a point in this process where managing thoughts and managing words is no longer the hardest terrain you cross. Something more persistent steps into the room. Emotions. Not the manageable ones that dissolve before they fully form, but the ones that arrive with velocity. The anger that tells you something must be said right now. The insecurity that drafts its own defense before you even understand the threat. The doubt that talks steadily until it drowns everything else out. This is where theory and practice diverge sharply. It is easy to describe composure when nothing is testing it. Emotions are real forces, but they are also temporary ones. They build, peak, pass, and recede. Every single time, without exception. The difficulty is that in the moment they are peaking, they do not feel temporary. They feel like facts. They create a sense of urgency, a pressure to act, to say something, to do something, to relieve the intensity in any way available. And the path of least resistance is always immediate expression. But here is what happens when you choose a different path. When you feel that surge and you do not immediately obey it, a small gap opens. It is almost imperceptible at first, barely a pause. But in that pause, something pivots. You are no longer being carried by the emotion. You are alongside it, feeling it fully, but not executing its instructions automatically. That distinction between what you feel and what you do is where the real work begins. It is not about suppression. Suppression is just another form of losing control, only in the opposite direction. It is about ownership, acknowledging the emotion completely while retaining the authority to decide how it gets expressed, when it gets expressed, or whether it needs to be expressed at all. This is where discipline transforms from a concept into an actual practice. It requires not just intellectual understanding, but pattern recognition. Knowing yourself well enough to identify your own triggers before they complete their sequence. Recognizing the physical signals, the tightening in the chest, the sudden narrowing of perspective, the acceleration of breath, the mental shift from observation to accusation. These are signals, not commands. The moment you stop treating them as commands is the moment your relationship with them changes fundamentally. Instead of reacting within the first second, you wait. Not passively, not with gritted teeth, but with the deliberate intention to understand what is actually happening rather than only what it feels like is happening. In that widened frame, other information becomes available. Context, consequence. The version of events that your initial reaction was about to skip entirely. You do not become slow or hesitant. You become deliberate. There is a significant practical difference between those two things. Hesitation is the inability to act. Deliberateness is the choice to act after full consideration rather than before it. There is a specific kind of strength in being the steady presence in a room where everything else is moving fast. Not because you are suppressing your response, but because you are directing it. And the emotion is present. It is real and acknowledged, but it is no longer the decision maker. You are. Most people do not develop this capacity because they never question the assumption that a strong feeling justifies an immediate action. But intensity and accuracy are not the same thing. A feeling can be overwhelming and still be pointing you in the wrong direction. The strength of an emotion is not a reliable signal about the wisdom of acting on it. That gap between feeling and action is where the Stoics located real freedom. No man is free who is not master of himself. That statement is not about restriction. It is about sovereignty. The only sovereignty that cannot be taken away from you because it exists entirely inside the territory of your own responses. As you continue practicing this, when the intensity of emotionally charged moments does not necessarily diminish, but your navigation of them changes profoundly. What once swept you immediately into reaction now passes through a different internal process. The same trigger, but a different architecture for receiving it. And over time, you recognize something almost surprising. Those moments are where the habit was built. Not in the easy stretches, but in the moments of real pressure. The moments you chose the pause when every instinct was pushing for the reaction. Each one of those choices, small as it felt in the moment, was adding to something structural. There is a reason the same situations tend to produce the same reactions in most people. The patterns are not random. They were built through repetition. Responses shaped over years by the need to feel safe, to maintain connection, to avoid certain kinds of pain. And because they were built through repetition, they can be changed through repetition. The direction simply reverses. The first time you interrupt a habitual reaction, the gap is fragile. It barely exists. The old pattern is right there, waiting to reassert. And often it does. But even then, something has shifted. You have experienced the pause. You know it is possible. And that knowledge, confirmed through experience rather than just described in language, becomes the foundation for the next attempt. As awareness deepens, you begin to understand not just the surface of the reaction, but its origin. The impulse to over-explain, a fear of being misjudged, the impulse to dominate a conversation, a discomfort with uncertainty, nor the impulse to withdraw entirely, a history of situations where staying cost too much. These underlying currents become visible, and once they are visible, the reaction above them begins to lose some of its automated quality. As Carl Jung observed, until what operates unconsciously is brought into consciousness, it will direct the course of your life, and you will interpret it simply as fate. That is a precise description of what changes when this kind of awareness develops. You stop experiencing your reactions as things that simply happen to you. You start experiencing them as choices. Imperfect, sometimes poorly made, but choices nonetheless. There is a space, always, in every situation, between what happens to you and how you respond. That space is almost invisible when the habit of immediate reaction is strong. But it expands with attention. It can be trained, and once it becomes reliably accessible, it becomes the most practical tool in your possession. Not because it eliminates difficult emotions, but because it allows you to meet them without being defined by them. Anger does not have to become conflict. Doubt does not have to become paralysis. Insecurity does not have to become defensiveness. The emotion is present, but you are more present. And that margin of awareness, that reliable capacity to choose, is what the Stoics meant when they spoke about inner freedom. Not the absence of experience, the mastery of response. As this sense of internal authority becomes more familiar, something else sharpens alongside it. An awareness of where your energy is actually being spent throughout the course of a day. Not in a critical or analytical way, just a clearer perception. Conversations that drain without returning anything. Habits that consume time while producing nothing meaningful. The constant small leaks of attention that, added together, account for an enormous portion of each day. This recognition can feel unsettling at first, because it forces honest contact with the fact that much of your time has been spent without real intention. Not wasted, obviously, or dramatically, but spread thin across things that never genuinely mattered. And once that pattern is visible, it cannot be unseen. You begin to notice your own automatic behaviors with new clarity, the habitual reach for distraction, the impulse to stay engaged in a conversation that stopped producing value several exchanges ago, the tendency to respond to things that were never actually asking for your response. This awareness carries no harshness. It is simply clarity about cost, the recognition that your attention is a limited resource, and that every moment you invest in one thing is simultaneously a moment you are not investing elsewhere. That trade-off becomes tangible, and because it becomes tangible, your choices begin to shift. The pull toward unnecessary engagement weakens, not because you are forcing yourself to resist, but because you have started to see clearly what you are trading away. And that visibility changes the equation. The distraction loses its appeal not through willpower but through understanding. This is where a kind of productive distance begins to form, not from people or obligations, but from everything that does not contribute to where you are actually trying to go. You begin stepping back from unnecessary involvement, not abruptly, not with announcement, simply, more slowly, more deliberately, more carefully. You respond less impulsively, You engage less reflexively. You allow more space between yourself and the constant demands that once felt non-negotiable. And in that space, your energy begins to consolidate. You feel less scattered, less pulled in competing directions. The noise that once seemed unavoidable begins to recede, not because it has gone quiet, but because your relationship to it has changed. There is a fundamental difference between being busy and being purposeful. Busyness offers constant reassurance, the feeling of movement, of relevance, of not falling behind. But when examined closely, a significant portion of that activity leads nowhere in particular. It is motion without direction. And once you feel the difference between those two states, busyness for its own sake loses its appeal permanently. This does not represent a withdrawal from life. It represents a refinement of engagement. You are still present, still contributing, but with more care about where that presence actually goes. You begin to notice how much lighter things feel when your attention is not constantly divided. Tasks that once produced resistance become approachable, not because they've changed, but because you're meeting them with full focus rather than fractional attention. Conversations carry more meaning because you are actually inside them rather than partially elsewhere. Even rest becomes genuinely restorative rather than just a gap between demands. As Seneca observed, to be everywhere is to be nowhere. When attention is spread indefinitely across everything, nothing receives enough of it to matter. That principle applies as directly today as it did in ancient Rome, perhaps more directly, given how many competing demands now exist for every available second. The quiet confidence that grows from this selectivity is not about cutting off the world or becoming distant from it. It is about understanding clearly what adds value and what does not, what accelerates your direction and what merely occupies your time. And once that distinction is clear, your actions begin to reflect it naturally, not as discipline, but as judgment. The realization that matters most in this process is not about time management or productivity in the conventional sense. It is about recognizing that time is not the scarce resource. Intention is. And as that settles, priorities realign not through effort, but through clarity. You become less drawn to things that once seemed important, less pulled toward distractions that once consumed entire hours, more oriented toward what actually compounds, what grows with sustained attention, what produces real results over real time. This does not happen overnight. It accumulates through small decisions, repeated consistently. Choosing not to engage when engagement adds nothing, choosing to stay focused when distraction offers easier relief, choosing to step back from what pulls without contributing. Each choice, individually, is small. Collectively, they produce a different kind of life rhythm, one characterized by deliberate motion rather than reactive churn. And as that rhythm takes hold, a different kind of progress becomes visible, not the rushed and anxious kind that burns itself out. The quiet, steady, compounding kind that builds something capable of lasting. This is where everything begins to converge. Thinking with restraint reduces the noise. Speaking with intention reduces unnecessary output. Protecting your energy ensures that what remains is directed toward something worth building. And once those three things align, pulling back no longer feels like sacrifice. It feels like precision. As your attention gathers, pulled away from what does not merit it, directed toward what does, something begins to form in the space created. It is not loud. It does not announce itself. But it is unmistakably present. A quality of movement that feels fundamentally different from how you once operated. You are no longer reactive to the shape of each incoming hour. You are intentional about it. There is a pause before decisions, not hesitation, but the brief space of genuine consideration. You are no longer saying yes to everything because saying yes is easier than saying no. You are choosing, and that choice, exercised consistently, creates a kind of precision in how your days actually unfold. Things that once felt pressing lose their urgency. Distractions become easier to identify and easier to decline. And what remains, The things that actually matter become more visible precisely because the surrounding clutter has been reduced. This shift is gradual, and then it is sudden. You stop pursuing every opportunity that presents itself, not from lack of ambition, but from a clearer understanding of what deserves your specific focus. There is a difference between being driven and being scattered, between momentum and mere motion. Once you can feel that difference from the inside, you stop confusing them. Your approach to work changes. Conversations carry more weight. Time alone feels different, not like something to fill, but like something to use. And because your attention is no longer divided and scattered, progress appears in places that had been stagnant for a long time. There is a particular quality of calm that comes from operating this way, not the absence of activity. You are still engaged, still building, but the frantic quality has gone out of it. You are not chasing anything. You are not performing effort for an audience. You are moving at your own pace, in your own direction, and that pace, maintained consistently, takes you far deeper than speed ever could. As this becomes your default mode, the way others experience your presence shifts subtly, not because you have become more impressive or more visible, because there is a different quality to how you engage. People listen more carefully when you speak. They respond differently to your actions, not because you are demanding attention, but because you are clearly not performing for it. The absence of performance is itself notable. You no longer need to justify your choices constantly or defend your direction at every challenge. There is a self-referencing quality to how you operate, a groundedness that does not depend on external confirmation. You know where your focus is, and that knowledge makes it easier to let go of everything competing to redirect it. Challenges still appear. Disruptions still occur, but your response to them carries a different quality. You are not captured by every complication. You are not derailed by every difficulty. You choose your engagements with care. And that carefulness is a form of authority over your own experience that most people never fully claim. As that way of operating continues to develop, a broader integration begins to take shape, not as something you are consciously managing, but as something that has become simply how you function. You notice it in your thinking first. The internal noise has genuinely decreased, not because you have forced it out, but because you have stopped feeding it. Thoughts that once triggered immediate loops now pass through without claiming much. What remains in your mind is sharper, more functional, more honest about what actually deserves consideration. The same shift appears in your speech. Words are no longer filler. They are not pressure management. They are communication, sometimes fewer of them, sometimes more, but always with a clarity of intent that was not there before. The compulsion to explain everything fades. The need to defend yourself against every perceived challenge dissolves. What replaces it is a directness that others register even when they cannot name what makes it different. Focus follows the same arc. It no longer requires constant effort to achieve. You return to it naturally, almost automatically, and without the internal resistance that once characterized every attempt to concentrate. Distractions still exist. The world has not simplified, but they no longer carry the same gravitational pull. When your attention shifts, you notice sooner. You return without judgment, and that ease of return, more than any dramatic improvement in willpower, is what makes the difference over time. What once required deliberate discipline begins to function as natural alignment. The structure is no longer something imposed from outside. It has been internalized. And because of that, maintaining it costs far less than it once did. It has become part of how you operate rather than something you have to constantly remember to do. As Epictetus said, first decide clearly what you intend to be, and then do what that requires. That sequence matters. The clarity comes before the action. Not simultaneously, not after. The person you intend to be is the filter through which everything else passes. Every decision about where to direct your energy, what to say, what to leave unsaid, what to pursue, what to release. The deeper realization that emerges from this entire process is quiet but significant. The strength you were looking for was never somewhere to be found or added. It was already present, obscured by everything that was covering it. The unnecessary thoughts, the reactive words, the scattered habits that consumed energy without contributing anything. One by one, those things begin to fall away. And what remains is not a new version of you. It is a clearer version of what was always there. Problems that previously felt overwhelming become navigable, not because circumstances have changed, but because your approach has changed. You are no longer layering interpretation on top of interpretation, compounding what is actually a manageable situation into something unmanageable. You are seeing it clearly, and clear perception is already most of the solution. Decisions carry less weight because the process of making them has simplified. You assess, you decide, you move. You do not spend 3 days second-guessing a choice already made. You trust the direction, adjust as real information arrives, and continue. That trust, in your own capacity to navigate whatever comes, replaces the endless reassurance seeking that once filled the same space. There is a quiet confidence in this state. Not the performed kind that announces itself, not the anxious kind that requires constant affirmation. Simply the reliable knowledge of how you think, how you decide, how you move through difficulty. That familiarity with your own process is itself a form of stability. You are not surprised by yourself, and in not being surprised, you can trust yourself. This does not mean everything becomes easy or that difficulty stops arriving. Challenges remain, uncertainty remains, but your footing within them is different. You are not shaken as easily. You are not pulled as far off course. You return to center faster because the center is better established, and as Marcus Aurelius put it, stop wasting time debating what a good person should be. Be one. The shift is from endless discussion about direction to actual movement in a direction. Less analysis, less rehearsal. More deliberate action aligned with who you have decided to be. As this becomes your default orientation, the compulsive drive to improve in obvious ways begins to quiet down. Not because the work is finished, but because the foundation is stable. You are not constantly correcting from a scattered state. You are building from a position of clarity. Each step adds to the one before it. Each decision reinforces the direction you have chosen. Movement forward replaces the repetitive cycle of returning to the same starting point. Everything integrates. Thinking with restraint creates the conditions for clarity to exist. Speaking with intention makes every word carry more weight. Directing your focus with genuine selectivity builds something meaningful from what would otherwise have been scattered effort. And together these three, not as a formula, not as a system, but as a coherent way of being, produce a life that feels fundamentally different from one lived in constant reaction. There is no complexity required here, no elaborate methodology. The strength that seemed hidden in difficulty was always available through simplicity, through removing what does not serve you, until what remains can be seen clearly and used fully. Once you experience that state, even briefly, even partially, the question changes. You are no longer asking how to do more. You are asking how to do what matters, and do it completely, without division, without distraction, without the constant noise of everything that never deserved your attention in the first place. Less noise, less reaction, more clarity, more authority over your own experience. That shift, quiet, gradual, occasionally uncomfortable, ultimately transformative, is where everything else begins. If Stoic Horizon has contributed something useful to how you think today, consider hitting like. It helps more people find this kind of content. And if this is the kind of thinking you want more of, subscribing to Stoic Horizon means you'll be here when the next piece of it arrives. Not out of habit, as a choice.